Carter family moved into their new home in the suburbs of Ohio during the spring of 2003. It was a charming two-story house built in the 1970s, with a large backyard perfect for their two kids, Ellie and Max, to run around. Sarah and Dave Carter had saved for years to finally afford a place of their own, and this house seemed like the perfect place to settle. The first month passed without incident. The kids loved their new rooms, Sarah got busy decorating, and Dave spent weekends working on the lawn. It wasn't until early June when they started noticing odd things happening around the house. One evening, while Sarah was unpacking boxes in the basement, she heard footsteps above her on the main floor. She assumed it was Dave or one of the kids and didn't think much of it. But when she came upstairs, she found the house completely empty. Dave had taken the kids to the park, and they weren't back yet. She brushed it off, assuming the house's creaky floors were to blame. But over the next few weeks, other strange things began happening. Ellie, their 8-year-old daughter, complained of hearing someone whispering her name at night, even though no one was in her room. Max, their 5-year-old son, started waking up in the middle of the night screaming about a sad lady sitting at the foot of his bed. One night, while the family was eating dinner, a loud bang came from the kitchen. They all rushed in to find every cabinet door flung open. Dave tried to explain it away as air pressure, but Sarah couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. The final straw came on a warm July night. Sarah was home alone, the kids staying with her parents for the weekend, and Dave working late. She was watching TV in the living room when the temperature suddenly dropped. She wrapped herself in a blanket, assuming the AC had kicked on, but when she checked, the air was off. The room felt unnaturally cold. Then she heard it, soft crying. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway near the stairs. Sarah's heart pounded as she stood up, slowly making her way to the source of the sound. The crying grew louder, more desperate, until Sarah reached the base of the stairs. Standing at the top of the staircase was the faint outline of a woman. She was dressed in what looked like a faded 1980s-style blouse and jeans, her hair dark and messy, hanging in front of her face. The crying stopped, and the woman raised her head, revealing pale, hollow eyes filled with anguish. Sarah froze, unable to move or scream. The figure took a step down the stairs, her hand reaching out as if pleading for help. Sarah's knees went weak, and she backed into the living room, fumbling for her phone. As she dialed Dave's number, the figure vanished, leaving behind an icy chill that lingered in the house. When Dave came home, Sarah was trembling. She told him everything, and they decided to do some research on the house. After hours spent digging through old records and talking to longtime neighbors, they discovered a chilling piece of history. In 1984, a young woman named Lisa Matthews had lived in their home. She had been a school teacher, well liked by the community, until one night she disappeared without a trace. Her boyfriend at the time, a man with a history of violence, was suspected of foul play, but without a body or sufficient evidence, no charges were ever filed. Lisa's disappearance remained a cold case. The more they learned about Lisa, the more certain Sarah became that her spirit was still in the house, trapped and seeking justice. Ellie's whispers, Max's visions of the sad lady, the cold spots, and Sarah's own encounter all pointed to the same conclusion. The Carters were torn. They had poured their savings into the house, but they couldn't ignore what was happening. After a few more weeks of eerie occurrences, doors slamming on their own, objects moving inexplicably, and more sightings of the woman at the top of the stairs, they made the difficult decision to move. Before they left, Sarah visited the local police department, sharing what they had experienced. She didn't expect anyone to believe her, but she felt compelled to at least try. To her surprise, a detective who had worked on Lisa's case agreed to reopen the investigation. A few months after they left the house, Sarah received a call from that same detective. New evidence had been found, old letters and photographs hidden in the house's walls during renovations. These clues eventually led to a confession from Lisa's former boyfriend, who was finally arrested and convicted for her murder nearly 2 decades later. The Carters never went back to the house, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa's spirit had been at peace once her killer was brought to justice. While they didn't live there long, the family's experience became part of the house's lore, an old home haunted by the tragic memory of a woman whose life was cut short, but whose story finally found an ending. I moved into the house on a rainy October afternoon. It was an old Victorian home, sitting on the outskirts of a quiet New England town. The real estate agent had mentioned its charm and character, but skirted around why it had been on the market for so long. The price was too good to pass up, though, and I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. The first few days were quiet, almost eerily so. The house creaked with age, the wind rattling through the old windows, but nothing I couldn't explain. It wasn't until the second week that things started to feel off. I would come home from work to find the lights on, even though I was certain I had turned them off. At first, I chalked it up to forgetfulness. But then, one night, I was sitting in the living room when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone pacing. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just the house settling. I went upstairs to check, but of course no one was there. The next morning, I noticed something odd in the hallway, a door that I hadn't noticed before. It was a narrow old door with a brass knob set flush into the wall. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I thought it might lead to an attic or crawl space, but there was no key. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the pacing again. But this time it was louder, closer. I could swear it was right outside my bedroom door. I lay there, frozen, as the sound of footsteps stopped abruptly. Then, a soft knocking began on the door. My breath caught in my throat. I gathered the courage to get up, but when I opened the door, there was nothing but an empty hallway. The following days were a blur of strange occurrences. Objects would move on their own. Doors would open and close, always the same one. The door I couldn't unlock. I began to dread going to bed, knowing I'd hear the footsteps, the pacing, and that incessant knocking. My sleep became restless, and I started seeing fleeting shadows in the corners of my vision. One night, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer soft but frantic, as if something, or someone, was desperate to get in. I felt a chill down my spine. I knew I had to do something, so I decided to call a paranormal investigator. The investigator arrived the next day, a calm, older man who had seen it all. He walked through the house, his expression unreadable. He paused in front of the mysterious door, running his fingers along the frame. "There's something here," he said quietly. "Something that hasn't left." We decided to do a seance that night. I was skeptical, but I had no other options. We sat in the living room, candles flickering as the investigator began speaking softly, calling out to whatever presence was in the house. At first, nothing happened. The house was silent, and I almost felt relieved. But then, the temperature in the room dropped. The candle flames flickered wildly, and I heard the footsteps again, this time coming from the hallway. The investigator's voice grew firmer, and then, suddenly, the knocking started. It was coming from the door. With trembling hands, I followed the investigator upstairs. The knocking grew louder as we approached the door, and then, without warning, it swung open on its own. Behind the door was a small, dusty room, empty, except for an old rocking chair that creaked as it moved gently back and forth. The investigator stepped inside cautiously, and that's when I saw her, a figure, faint but unmistakable, sitting in the chair. She was pale, her eyes sunken, her expression sad and longing. She stared straight at me and then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, let me go." The investigator nodded as if he understood and began speaking softly again, a prayer of sorts. Slowly, the figure began to fade, the air in the room feeling lighter. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped, and the house fell silent. The investigator turned to me. She was trapped here, in this room. She couldn't move on. I moved out of the house a month later. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of the house still holding on to its secrets. I never found out who she was or why she had been trapped there, but I knew one thing. I would never forget the sound of those footsteps, and the knocking that echoed in my dreams long after I was gone.